Hello, Psych 1100. Boy, we're sure getting close to the end of the course. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about persuasion. And, you know, I know I've said it before, but let's face it, Buckeyes have some pretty high-level pride in being Buckeyes. And then you'll see even within areas or departments that pride goes even a tad deeper. So when we talk a brief history of persuasion, we're talking really part of what established the Ohio State Social Psychology graduate program to be what it is, a top contender, always ranked number 1 through 5 annually. Throughout its history, and it owes at least some of that in part to the strong research, the strong theories that surround attitudes and persuasion. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little attitude. We're going to talk a little persuasion with Penelope. So she's persuading you how cute she is. God, she loves this. I don't get it, but she is such a ham. Right? So attitude is something that employers, teachers, families, everyone is concerned about attitude, consumer research about attitude. And so we're going to start with attitude. And maybe at work you've seen stupid posters like this, and I call them stupid because there's really no demonstration, no empirical support for their efficacy. Attitude is a decision. Well, is it? Maybe not. But when we oversimplify things like these, it becomes meaningless. Or positive attitude, it changes everything, right? And a lot of times people think, you know, by putting a couple of these posters up, then we're good to go, man. The company has been transformed and people will go above and beyond. But maybe not, right? You like coffee? No. All right. Enough of that. We got to get to work here. So get busy, sweetie. But then maybe it's like this. Look, man, so far today I've shit my pants, puked on myself, I've had my temperature taken, and it's only 9 a.m. Coochie this, right? And so attitudes, you know, can go either way, and it's really a product of our environment and who we are. So it's kind of a perfect nexus of the power of the situation combined with the awesomeness of our personalities. So attitude defined, and I took an attitudes class at Ohio State, as a graduate student, and it was one of our required classes in social psychology. Big surprise. I actually took it, I believe, at the beginning of my second year because it was only offered every other year. So attitude defined, and it's cool because I'm sitting there in this class, and I sit in the back typically. I know you should be sitting in the front, but I typically sit in the back, and I'm looking, and there's Krosnick, big-time attitude researcher, and there's Rich Petty. So they're there on the first day of class, and they're going to co-teach this class, and Rich Petty is Mr. Attitudes. You know, probably one of the 10 most cited theories in all of social psychology was developed by Petty and Cassiopo along with their graduate students, right? You need attention paid to you. So I'm sitting in the class and I'm thinking, boy, this is cool. You know, this is as good as it gets, man. Here I am in attitudes class at Ohio State, taught by Petty and Krosnick. This is freaking fantastic. And they gave us this definition. And it's such a cool definition for attitudes. It's an individual's latent evaluative orientation towards an object, favorable, unfavorable, at some degree of intensity. And it's like, whoa. Okay, that sounds cool. It's tight, it's pithy, but then when you start to unpack it, it really kind of contains the core. Well, it's the definition of attitudes, right? And it's written by these brilliant men. So what do we know? Well, it's an individual's latent evaluative orientation. So an attitude is an evaluation to some degree. That's right there, and it says that it's an individual. And it's towards an object, so this is the valuing of an object, what we would call an attitude object. Yes, that's simple. But now the evaluation could be favorable or unfavorable, okay? And at some degree of intensity. So attitudes can be positive or negative, and they can be strong or weak, and that's embedded in this definition. Now, the latent evaluative orientation is a tricky one because it's latent. It can be operating behind the scenes, and this opens the door for conscious and non-conscious attitudes. So in all, this is just an amazingly cool definition. So functions of attitudes, what do attitudes do for us? Well, Attitudes help us gain rewards and avoid punishments. That is, as we encounter attitude objects in our environment, we then place a negative, positive tag on them at some degree, right? Well, this is how punishment or rewards work. That if I'm given something that I evaluate positively, I have a positive attitude towards, then it's a reinforcer. Whereas if I have a negative evaluation of an object and someone pushes on me, then it operates as a punishment. So at the very foundation of behavioral learning, really we have to look at the idea of attitudes as being evaluating consequences as either punishments or as rewards, essentially negative or positive. Now, knowledge. Well, it helps us understand our information about the world. So attitudes really inform us of our relationships with all the objects that are available. And I have an extremely positive attitude towards Penelope, right? And she has a positive attitude towards me, and that makes it then fun for us to engage, except when she bites and scratches. And she's a youngster, so she'll, I hope, grow out of that. But so. And your attitudes. When I get compliments on these video lectures, what do you think the compliment is for? Do you think students are telling me, oh my God, dude, I love the way you speak, or oh my God, dude, fantastic content, oh my God, nice organization? No, I don't hear any of that, right? And I don't expect to. I'm not looking for compliments. What I hear is, I love Penelope and I want to see more Penelope. So, you know, Penelope's a pretty well-known cat now, at least to a bunch of Buckeyes. So, go Penelope. Now, attitudes take on a value expressive. They reflect our strong ideas linked to self-esteem, right? And think about it, political attitudes, these are value expressive. And people are going to great lengths to express their political attitudes. They're attending rallies, we have protesters, we have marchers, we have demonstrations, right? These are people that expressing their attitudes, their values is associated with their attitudes, and this actually boosts self-esteem typically to express one's values, all else being equal. Now, ego defensive, it helps us to avoid anxiety and to protect our self-esteem. So by maintaining attitudes and keeping these attitudes, being in touch with these attitudes, then we can free ourselves from situations that might be compromising in that regard. Now, as I alluded to with this kind of latent evaluative orientation in the definition, that there's explicit and implicit attitudes, right? Explicit attitudes are the attitudes to which we have conscious access. So when I use a questionnaire to query you on your stance on some position or your evaluation of some object, I'm looking for your explicit attitude. We can report on these when we're asked to do so. They're attitudes that have been historically assessed and measured. This is where the attitudes research began, right? But come the 1980s, there started to be rumblings of this huge unconscious, but I'm a social psychologist, so I'm going to call it non-conscious experience of our world. And what we found now is, as neuroscientists are kind of really taking the lead here, saying, hey, up to 98% of your brain, depending on who you speak to, 90% of your cognitive mechanism is operating outside your awareness, leaving you with maybe only 2% consciousness that you are allowed to access in your brain. So a lot of attitudes are implicit. That is, they run below the radar. And the question is, does it matter? Well, certainly they affect behavior, they affect perceptions. There's been a lot of research to demonstrate that. And some creative people are now beginning to learn how to, since like the 90s, right, beginning to learn how to assess these implicit, these non-conscious attitudes. The implicit association test is probably one of the most well-known by Greenwald and Banaji, right? Banaji's at Harvard, Greenwald's at University of Washington at Seattle, but where is Greenwald's legacy? Yep, Ohio State Social Psychology. So what we're looking at here is ways to measure attitudes that people can't even or don't recognize that they have of their own. And this morphs into the idea of like unconscious bias training for police officers. Do they have implicit attitudes, implicit, let's say, racist attitudes that affect their perception, affect the way they deal with suspects? And many people have suggested, well, we need to do implicit bias training for police officers. A lot of us kind of stand back and say, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if this will work. I'm not sure how we'll measure the results. I'm not sure what the training needs to look like. It's an area to be explored, but I wouldn't say that it's a solution. And many people in the press right now say, if we do implicit bias training, this problem will go away. I'm not sure about that. So, also, if you want to learn more about this specifically, remember that Ohio State Social Psych offers an attitudes class, right? So you can take this class and you can spend a whole semester digging deep into attitudes with some of the people who know more about attitudes than any other people on the planet. This is part of our Ohio State legacy, and often it's a good idea to take advantage of these things that Ohio State offers, right? So we may or may not have conscious access to these attitudes. They may coexist with inconsistent explicit attitudes. And this begs a question that was asked of us in our candidacy exam, our big exam to see if we can advance to the PhD program. One of them was this idea of how can you demonstrate, implicit, explicit attitudes and maybe detect the difference. So basically we were asked to design an experiment, and I remember in my exam the experiment I offered was, well, how about if we understand what a participant's food preferences were as a child, and how many of you have learn to enjoy foods that you didn't like as a child? You're still pretty young, so maybe that hasn't occurred for you. But like, for example, as a kid, I hated tomatoes. But now I love tomatoes. I grow tomatoes, and the first tomato that ripens is like this tremendous gift of nature, right? And I just enjoy the hell out of this tomato. But I hated tomatoes as a child. I wouldn't eat them at all. Now, the question is, what happens when an attitude changes? Does the old attitude get overwritten, or does it coexist with the new attitude, right? And how can we find out? And I had designed an experiment which would allow us to tap into that. There's a lot of interesting questions about attitudes that remain unanswered. Hey, Annika. Well, you came to join us. Hello, Annika. So this gets us to the idea of measuring attitudes, and we can use direct measures or we can use indirect measures. Now, some people will call it explicit and implicit measures, but the folks in the social psych attitudes area do not like the term implicit measures. They say it makes no sense because if it was an implicit measure, then people wouldn't be able to detect it and you couldn't use it. So indirect measures and direct measures have been the preferred terminology, at least within our area. So direct measures, self-reports of various kinds. Maybe you've gotten a telephone survey asking about your attitudes toward candidates in this election or issues, right? Probably more candidates than anything else. So that's one way to do it, right? Now indirect measures are on the down low and take some creativity. Now there can be physiological measures. We can look at automatic associations that the implicit association test would tap into. We can look at behavioral measures. So all of these, and for example, body language. If I'm developing a negative attitude towards someone on the basis of what they're saying, then you may observe me as a conversation occurs, cross my arms like this, right? Or step back, or turn, or somehow change my facial expression. Notice these are all behavioral measures that might indicate attitude change. These are generally more difficult to deal with as far as analysis, but can be very useful. So direct measures, questionnaires, surveys. The downside is people may not want to admit their real attitude and they lie, or they somehow back off on their attitude. So if someone feels that their questionnaire might be reviewed, face to face, they may not admit their true attitude. When we're dealing with sensitive topics, right, then often the self-presentation concerns loom their ugly head. Sexual practices, drug use would be examples. If you want to survey for those things, you really need to make the survey and the survey respondent believe that they're anonymous. In the lab, if we were assessing attitudes on sensitive topics, what we would do is, if we're using a paper and pencil task, someone has a questionnaire, right, we would say, hey, so once you're done with that part of the experiment, then we want you to report your reactions here, your attitudes, and please don't put your name on that paper because we want it to be anonymous, so don't do anything that would identify you on that paper. And then often we go through the kind of the theater of having a stack of these questionnaires that are filled out, and they may be legit or they may be just ones we made up. But then we ask the person, just on your way out, right, place it in the stack. And if we're using cameras, what we would observe is often people would take the stack and they would pull the stack up and insert their questionnaire right into the center of it, right? So they believe that it's further protecting their anonymity. So the self-presentation, right? But now the other issue, and it's probably more daunting to get around, is they might not really be aware of their actual attitudes. And this can be problematic, especially when you're asking someone a question about something they really haven't thought about much. And we ask them, so what's your attitude about this? And they feel compelled to report an attitude, but they haven't really thought about it, and they might not be in touch with that attitude. So it might misrepresent their attitude. Now, when we collect this data, we can array it on ranking scales or rating scales. So rate these, rank these 10 items in order of your preference, right? Or we can use just a rating scale. How much do you like this particular object? Not at all, to like totally, with maybe 7 steps represented in the scale. Ranking scales are cool and they can be very useful. They're just a little harder to deal with statistically. So you'll see most of the time people rely on rating scales. It's easier to process the results statistically. Now, rating scales can be unipolar. So how much do you favor this? A unipolar scale goes from 0 to a lot, right? And then a bipolar scale goes from the negative to the positive. So unipolar scale, absence of attitude to attitude. Bipolar scale captures negative attitude to positive attitude. The problem with the bipolar scale is always that central point. What does that central point mean? Does it mean it doesn't apply? Does it mean no? So that becomes problematic. One thing I learned, and I took a class with Krosnick, questionnaire design. And let's just say that a quarter-long class in questionnaire design probably isn't the most exciting class you'll ever take, but it will be one of the most useful classes you'll ever take. And he was in the process of writing a book on scale design. Fascinating. Thurstone did a lot of this work way back, in the 1920s, I believe, on scaling. Now, one of the issues is, though, that it's possible to have dual attitudes. So what's your attitude towards smoking, Mark? And I smoked for probably, 25, 30 years of my life off and on. And when I did smoke, I was a heavy smoker. And my parents had smoked, and it's just kind of the thing that you do, especially back then. And you ask me back then, what's your attitude towards smoking? And it's like, well, I really like smoking. I mean, I love the sensation of the smoke going into my lungs. I love the little buzz you get off of it. The taste is cool, right? But then at the same time, I would say, what is your attitude towards smoking? And I say, well, smoking sucks. It shortens my breath. It makes it more likely that I'm going to get cancer. It costs a lot of money. And you say, well, wait a second. Now, what is your actual attitude towards smoking? And I'm like, well, there's benefits, there's pros, and there's cons. So often, we're locked into a world of dual attitudes. And so consider that, especially if you're going to have to create like an employee satisfaction survey or some such, that, a simple question is, how favorably do you rate this company? Well, it depends. Depends on what? Well, it depends on their policies versus the money, etc. So dual attitudes often kind of complicate the measure of attitudes. Now let's do some indirect measures. What can we do? Well, some of these have been tried and didn't work too well. Pupil size was used, and what they thought was positivity was a function of pupil dilation and negativity pupil constriction. It turns out, what really, when the pupil increases in size, then it's an indicator of intensity, the extent to which or how deeply held the attitude is, but not negativity or positivity, right? Galvanic skin response, that is the amount of perspiration on the skin, right? And again, this shows arousal, and it's better for intensity. Now, the facial electromyograph is an interesting device, and what the EMG does is you put sensors all over someone's face, and it's able to detect changes in the musculature that would lead to, let's say, a smile or a frown. So we can get a good handle on whether it's a negative or positive attitude. But notice the difficulty of using this device, and it's something you're not going to use in door-to-door survey research. Can you imagine? Hey, hang on a second. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, but before we do this, let me stick these 50 electrodes on your... No, it's not going to, So in the laboratory under limited conditions, maybe so. EEG and brain imaging. And when John Cacioppo left Ohio State around 2001, 2002, I was in my second or third year. He left to go to University of Chicago. Why? Because they had fMRI machines that were available to the psychologists, and he wanted to look at attitudes at the neural level at that point in time. And rest in peace, Cacioppo. He died about 3 years ago, really at a young age, and it's very sad. Behavioral measures. It can be all kinds of things. Body language is the one that pops to mind most easily. And then automatic associations is a match between, and in the IAT they might show you, let's say, a person who is obese versus a person who's skinny, right? And then they see how long, what is the response latency to hitting a button that either indicates good or bad. And what we see is that attitudes facilitate responding. We can actually measure the response time and garner information about someone's implicit, their non-conscious attitude. And it's interesting because it's hard to control, but the tests are fraught with challenges as well. So IAT, like I said, the implicit association test, and if you want to take an IAT, if you haven't already, you can type IAT into Google, right? And you'll be taken to Benagi's website now, running out of Harvard, and you have your choice of IATs that you could take. Okay? So enough on attitude measures. I want to stop now for part one, and let's move on to part